Through the evening that the showers disappear across many central and eastern parts of the UK. Clear skies then for eastern England, northeast Scotland as well. Thicker cloud arrives into the west by dawn and some outbreaks of rain into Northern Ireland and western Scotland. Temperatures then rising through the night in the northwest, but they'll fall and it will be a fairly chilly start for eastern parts of England. A bright start though, and a few mist patches first thing, soon lifting into the afternoon, and spells of rain across northern parts of the UK before it turns drier and brighter. Some cloud breaks developing and it will be windy. That wind coming from the southwest, so very mild air at the moment, 16 or 17 Celsius in the south, 14 to 16 further north. But it is windy, with the wind bouncing over the hills of northern England and southern Scotland to bring some strong wind gusts to the northeast and some gales around northern and western coast of Scotland, along with heavy rain for a time. That rain sinks south overnight, and so by the start of Wednesday it's wet for southern Scotland, Cumbria, Northern Ireland, and it is also increasingly windy through the Irish Sea. A mild night though, a very mild night in places, 14 or 15 Celsius in the south. Colder further north, but actually a brighter day to come there for northern and northwest Scotland. A few showers expected later. It's through the central zone where we're going to see strong winds blowing through the Irish Sea, and Cumbria, southwest Scotland, North Wales seeing some very wet weather, risk of flooding in places. That rain sinks south on Thursday and Friday, and it stays mild everywhere.
Very good evening to you. It's 8 o'clock. On Brazier tonight, is COVID really destined to fall away? In the run-up to Christmas, I'll be speaking to the SAGE member whose analysis makes Plan B far less likely. Also, I'm joined by one of the most influential and satirical voices in America's culture wars, Mark Steyn. And is the suit finished? Why the most famous name on Savile Row is hanging by a thread. All that's coming up. But first, a news update with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Here's the latest GB News headlines. The national living wage is set to rise 59 pence to £9.50 an hour. That's from April next year. The Treasury announcement, which is part of the autumn budget, means full-time workers will now see their income increase by more than £1,000 a year. The government says £5.9 billion is also being made available to help tackle NHS backlogs. Brexit Minister Lord Frost says the European Union's proposals to solve the Northern Ireland Protocol don't go far enough. Speaking before the Commons European Scrutiny Committee, Lord Frost argued some of the ideas put forward by the EU were problematic, but added the UK government welcomed aspects of the proposals.
What we're trying to test is whether they could found the basis to go further than what they've put on the table. So that's the kind of discussion that we're having. And it has been quite constructive so far, but the gaps between us remain significant, and there's a lot of working through to go.
Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen has told a parliamentary committee that the social media giant was unquestionably making online hate worse. Ms Haugen gave evidence to the Joint Committee for the draft Online Safety Bill as part of government plans for social media regulation. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg previously rejected her claims, saying her attacks on the company were misrepresenting the work it does. Middle East Minister James Cleverly has called Iran's detainment of the British-Iranian aid worker Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe indefensible and unacceptable. His comments came as her husband began his second hunger strike in 2 years after her latest appeal for freedom was rejected. Richard Ratcliffe is sleeping outside the Foreign Office, demanding the UK government takes more responsibility in securing his wife's release. Ms Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been held in Iran since 2016, accused of plotting against the government, but she's always denied any wrongdoing. Now, for most of us, the mere thought of visiting the dentist is unbearable. Take a look at this. Spare a thought for the polar bear, yeah, you got the pun, that's undergone root canal surgery at a wildlife park in Yorkshire. The 3-year-old named Sisu underwent hour-long operations after keepers noticed the 600-kilo animal had broken a tooth. You can see now he's chomping to get back to normal now at the Yorkshire Wildlife Park. He was a perfect patient and has made a full recovery. That's it from me. Now back to Colin.
Hi there, there's encouraging news on COVID tonight with the daily tally of cases confirming the growing view that infections have peaked. The Department of Health reported 36,657 new cases in the last 24 hours, down a quarter on the figure last week after 18 consecutive days of rising cases. This the second day in a row that cases have actually fallen. That in itself might not be sufficient evidence of a lasting decline, but it seems to underline the judgment reached by scientists that cases will plummet next month, even without Plan B restrictions like compulsory masks and working from home. In particular, one model from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine suggests infections will fall rapidly in the winter months. The Daily Telegraph is also reporting that other unpublished models seen by the government have also shown a dramatic fall in cases. Some suggest the number could be as low as 5,000 cases a day. That is before Christmas. Well, joining me, Professor John Edmonds, an expert in mathematical modelling of the virus at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He's also a member of the government's SAGE advisory group. Professor, thanks so much for your time this evening. We do appreciate it. Can we just talk about your modelling for the next month or two, and to what extent, if at all, the assumptions you've made differ from other modelling, and how much one model can vary from another?
Okay, well, there's basically 3 groups of us working on these sorts of scenarios for SAGE and ultimately the government. Ourselves, Imperial and Warwick. And we run a huge number of scenarios through all of our models. And of course, the 3 groups have slightly different models and they all come up with slightly different results and so on. And what the committee does SPY M is they put the different models together, compare them, and then pass them up to SAGE. And pretty much all 3 models are suggesting that cases might start to drop over the autumn. Ours was probably the most optimistic of the 3, which is probably why the Telegraph picked it up. But all 3 do suggest that cases are likely to may fall, although there's quite a lot of uncertainty attached to that.
I mean, you can see why people want to seize on optimism, and just as it was beginning to look like Plan B and all the measures I mentioned just a moment ago were potentially waiting there in the ante-room, waiting to be imposed. When you look at today's figures, I mean, in a sense, they are a confirmation of what you were projecting. One swallow doesn't necessarily make a summer, but 2 consecutive days suggest maybe the peak has passed.
I'd be careful about that. It's half term, and this wave of the epidemic has been driven by children, and huge rates of infection in children, absolutely huge rates of infection in children. And so the half term you would expect to see a flattening or even a decline over the half term period. I think what you have to do is then look after half term, what happens then? Does it take off again, or does it continue to fall?
Talked about a children's epidemic, haven't they? But I mean, the effects of half term surely haven't been felt yet.
Well, it depends. That all of the different parts of the country don't have half term exactly the same time. Private schools usually have 2 weeks off and so on. So there is a general effect that would happen around this time. So I think it's you shouldn't look at just a day or so's data anyway. But I would discount what happens this week. I don't think that's going to be terribly reliable. I think you have to then look a little bit further and see what happens after this.
Professor, just help us with some jargon. What you mentioned the Telegraph, this was the phrase contained within the Telegraph. I'm sure it's widely used in your sector. Endemic equilibrium, what do we mean by that?
Well, that's actually quite a difficult thing. So that's the virus becoming endemic in the population, and you would expect that to sort of fluctuate around some level, and that's the sort of equilibrium level. So once everything gets back to normal, that would be honestly, that's quite some way off. I'm talking probably years off. But once that gets back to normal, then you would expect the virus to fluctuate around some level. Probably higher at times like in the winter, and a bit lower at other times like in the summer, but fluctuating around some level. That's the endemic equilibrium.
And in terms of what's happening right now, is there a sense in which the government's been allowing infections to, certainly compared to some of our European counterparts, run a little bit hot? And compared to other continental European countries, our rate of hospitalisation, even our fatality rates, are relatively high. Is that a deliberate policy, do you think?
It must be, because they've had months to do something about it. So, because it's not something new, we've been at high levels of infection and hospitalizations and deaths since July, really. It dropped a little bit in the summer, but not very much. So we've been there for many months. So we could have taken action before, chosen not to. So that speaks volumes, I think.
I mean, you come at that from a clinical perspective. I mean, we're so far into this now. We know the competing arguments, don't we, about oncology cases that weren't treated, about economic decline, about lost education. And, there's a balance to be struck here. And, of course, that's for elected politicians.
I agree. There is definitely a balance to be struck, but I don't see how you're helping clear the backlog of oncology cases with 7,000 or 8,000 people in hospital for COVID.
How much are you feeding that line into government? I mean, when you...
They know the data, they make the decisions.
Yeah, OK. But you seem to be suggesting that actually there's a cause to lament some of that decision-making, what you just said there, that they're not balancing out those competing demands, or at least they're not attaching the level of priority to some of those measures that you would.
I don't think... I would have preferred to see some measures stay in place. Mask wearing, for instance, is not hugely effective, but it does have some role. It does help reduce transmission to some extent. And it's effectively cost-free. It doesn't cost the government anything to ask us to carry on wearing masks. It costs us a little bit, but hardly anything. So I don't really see the point of taking that out when there were still very high levels of infection. And there was back in July. And there is continuing to have, that is continuing now. So, so some measures I think would have been sensible to keep in place.
And Professor, your modelling is saying that come the spring, that there will be a resurgence of some description. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to be too specific about dates and things like that because there's a lot of things happening, and although cases have been fairly flat, there's a lot of things happening underneath the surface of that, and so I think it's very difficult to be too precise about things. But again, it's not just our work, but again, the work of the other two groups as well suggests that cases may come down in the short run, but then go back up again, and that's due to a combination of different factors. Primarily two things. One, us getting back to normal. We're not back to normal yet, but we ought to. At some point, you'd have thought we will get back to something more approximate. Our normal kind of contact patterns, normal working patterns, going to the pub and so on, whatever. And we're not there yet, and we're quite a long way off it actually. So when people go back, then obviously that will fuel the epidemic somewhat, in particularly in adults. And then the second thing is waning immunity. We did a fantastic job earlier in the year at vaccinating people, but we know that the immunity derived from the vaccine does decline. And so all of those people who are vaccinated will start to have slightly lower levels of protection and so on. So there's a big group of people who could potentially become reinfected at some point. And so the models suggest that might be, those two factors acting in conjunction might cause a resurgence of cases. Now, with the waning immunity, you can do something about it, of course. You can use the booster doses.
And the public health data was looking good, wasn't it?
I think that's what we have to do, is redouble our efforts there.
Yeah, and it seems like that's what we're doing. John Edmonds, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. 4 out of 5 calls to Police Scotland are not to report a crime. So says the Chief Constable, who's gone on the record with his concerns about the strain 999 calls made about mental health or addiction are putting on his officers. Ian Livingston, Chief Constable of Police Scotland, said the thin blue line was increasingly the first and last resort for patients in need of hospital care. The SNP government in Edinburgh has faced criticism for the way it's been running the health service in Scotland, with the Army recently drafted in to drive ambulances. Well, the Chief Constable said, or this is part of what he said, the ambulance service will not ask us to take people to hospital, but will we often be in a position with a citizen who needs to be taken to hospital and an ambulance is not available. Therefore, by definition, we end up taking them to hospital. He said this meant fewer officers were free to solve or prevent crimes. Let's turn to David Hamilton, the chairman of the Scottish Police Federation. David, thanks for your time this evening. Do appreciate it. What do you make of the Chief Constable's comments here? I mean, there is a sense in which he feels that his officers are not able to get on with the job for which they are trained and in position to take care of, namely solving crime.
Yes, he's absolutely correct, and it's exactly the point which we've been making in the last few weeks. Things have been getting particularly bad, exacerbated by the problems that the NHS are having, and police officers are having to step in as that service of last resort. So absolutely agree every single word he said today.
Can you just give us a concrete example of what's happening actually on the ground when somebody calls 999? I mean, is the ambulance just not getting there? I mean, we know there have been shortages of people able to, I mean, even taxis being used to get people to A&E. But, I mean, obviously, the police, in a sense, are the very final port of call, aren't they, for somebody in dire need? But are the ambulances simply not getting there, not being dispatched? Do you know what the process is on the ground and why it's going wrong?
The problem is fundamentally it's a whole system problem, and in Scotland the big challenge is actually getting the beds freed. So there's a lot of people who can't return to the community because the community system is short of staff. That then has a knock-on effect to accident emergency. So the ambulances are turning up there and can't deliver their patients to accident emergency, and that then puts a strain on the rest of the ambulance service. And we've had examples in the west of Scotland where police officers have been advised, don't ask for an ambulance because it'll be 8 hours before you get one. Now, this is no criticism of the ambulance service. They are absolutely flat out trying to do their best. But when they eventually get to that point where they can't cope, they're certainly not asking us to go and take people to hospital. But when somebody's lying in agony, because of a particularly bad fracture or somebody who's bleeding, as we've had, then we're not going to walk away from them. We're going to help them, and that's the difficulty of the situation here. So we're having to step in where other systems are beginning to fail. And health is just the latest line of them, and there's a number of different examples of that.
And obviously, David, if you're stepping in to do that, then you are stepping away from solving crimes. Is there any data to suggest that by focusing on one thing, that things are going wrong in another direction?
Well, yes. I mean, when we get to particular aspects such as mental health, I mean, these are very, very time-consuming, and our officers are really spending so much time now dealing with mental health issues for people in the public and the community, and we're having to take people for assessment and can't get away. So that's 2 officers tied up every time we take somebody in for mental health triage and assessment. And every time we're doing that, then they're not out on the street. So it's not a case even just of, preventative patrolling is becoming more and more difficult. We're actually now it's becoming to, really response policing and very little community work getting done because we're spending so much time essentially propping up other services. And as I say, it's not a criticism of the other services, it's just that they can't cope with the demand they've got and the resources they've got.
Yeah. David, just briefly, because I've been told we've got to wind this up, but I'm very curious as to what the Police Federation view in Scotland is of that recent decision by the SNP government to say we will caution drugs offences, effectively decriminalising even Class A possession. Is that making your job harder or easier?
It's too early to say. I think it's certainly an idea worth looking at, and we're, we'll wait and see how that goes. But I think the big question for us is what is the problem we're trying to fix here? I mean, police officers do have discretion as it stands, and it's not the case that, automatically people will be dealt with that way. So there's a lot of other operational questions which we have as to what happens if it happens on a repeat basis and so on. So a lot of detail to be worked through, but it's a great headline.
David Hamilton, thanks a lot. Party conference season is over, at least for the mainstream parties, but a week on Saturday will see the annual conference of a name that many people perhaps had thought had vanished from our political spectrum, the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, founded in the early 1980s by senior Labour figures who couldn't stand the leftwards drift of their movement and now enjoying a new lease of life. Rather than list the SDP's policies, it might help you get a handle on where they're coming from if I tell you who's speaking. Some of the people speaking at their conference: David Starkey, Lionel Shriver, Brendan O'Neill, Frank Furedi, Claire Fox, David Goodhart, Kathleen Stock and Rod Liddle, quite a number of our contributors on that list. I think probably all of them, actually. With me now, William Cluston, the leader of the SDP. William Cluston, thanks so much for joining us today. We do appreciate it. What are you offering that other parties aren't?
Well, we offer a blend, really, of what people would look at as left-wing politics and right-wing, but actually the blend works perfectly well. On economics, we're left-leaning, but we describe ourselves as culturally traditional. So that's basically the offer. And I think if you look at particular policies, it works very well. But I think broadly, people are crying out for something different. The Labour Party is in very, very serious trouble. I don't believe they're capable of winning a general election. They may not win a general election again. And the Conservatives are not governing us well. I think if you look at how we're governed in general, I think we could improve on things. So, yeah, I think people are crying out for something different. And we would argue that there's a sort of SDP-shaped hole in British politics, and we're filling it.
Let's imagine you fill a hole even so far as going all the way to Downing Street. If you were in government right now, how would you deal, for instance, with labour shortages? Because that poses a particular quandary, doesn't it, for a party that's left-leaning economically, but when it comes to social policy is a little more right-leaning, because your natural inclination, I suppose, would be not to smile on immigrants coming in and driving those lorries, but on the other hand, it needs to be done, doesn't it?
Oh, no, I wouldn't have any more. I wouldn't solve the problems in the haulage industry by importing labour. In fact, we've said we shouldn't do that. I think certain of these things are a result of literally ignoring training needs for 15, 20 years. And what Blair did was expand the universities foolishly. I mean, the university sector is far too big. We've neglected basic skills training, vocational skills and other things. And the only way you can cure that is actually putting the pressure on to actually incentivize companies and government to train people, and that's what's happening. I mean, I think, Colin, we're a little bit late coming into this because we voted to leave the EU, several years ago. and people haven't done enough about it. But you can't, every time there's a labour shortage, you can't solve it by just importing more people. Until we realise we've got to literally train our own fellow citizens, we're going to have these problems again and again.
William, just in terms of the style of the thing, what do you say to those who argue, here's a sensible prospectus, I can agree with an awful lot on it, like the analysis, that's convincing, fills a gap that's not filled by anybody else, but they just need to punch through. Maybe even their leader needs to be a bit, I don't know, more shouty.
Well, you can only be who you are. I mean, I think what the public don't want is inauthenticity. I think you've got to be yourself. We're a sensible political program. We're not a sort of here today, gone tomorrow party. You know, I joined the year after it started, 39 years ago. And if you look at our policy platform, it's serious. We're publishing a green paper on economics next month. Again, a serious bit of work, 30 pages, and it'll interest a lot of people. I think that's what people are looking for. I think we don't want to be governed by unserious people. We don't want to be governed by people that are more concerned with headlines this week than getting policy right. And I think, look at an issue like power generation, not top of the pops, but in fact, had Blair, you can't solve a problem like this instantly. Had Blair's government looked at nuclear power seriously 25 years ago, we'd have developed baseload. That would have been very helpful to industry. We want to reindustrialize. But you can't solve these things now. You've got to have long-term planning, and you've got to be serious. I think that's the sort of offer that the SDB has. I'm not going to get shouty. I mean, it's not really in my nature to be like that.
No, and I think that's probably to be applauded. William Clouston, appreciate your time. Thanks a lot. After the break, my special guest this Monday, one of the most acerbic voices in print, going to be in conversation with Mark Steyn. Ten years ago, if someone had told you that by 2021, uttering the word woman or mother was rude and using them might potentially cost you your job, how would you have reacted? If you'd been told then that statues of Churchill or Nelson had to be toppled, or that schools shouldn't teach Shakespeare or classical music because they might be offensive, what would you have said? Would your response have been, oh, well, you could see that coming? Or would it have been more like mine? Total blindsided incredulity, utter disbelief that the foundations of our culture, which seemed inviolable, unshakable, were actually liquefying beneath our feet. Well, here's another question. Why is it that the forces of tradition and orthodoxy, of patriotism and sovereignty, of family and faith, of common law and common sense, of freedom of expression, don't employ that most basic of intelligence techniques, namely to predict emerging threats so that they might be better confronted when they arrive? It's odd when you think about it. We live in an age of forecasting, from the weather to economics, from COVID to climate change. We're obsessed with the future. COP26 this week is an event almost entirely built on modelling how the world is about to get worse. But when it comes to what we've grown to call the culture wars, we don't bother. That's not because we can't guess what will happen, it's because we don't want to. We spend tens of millions of pounds every year on guesstimates. You're even paying for them. Most of the crystal ball gazing is taxpayer funded. The Treasury produces detailed forecasts about inflation and growth and exports. The Ministry of Defence war games Chinese aggression in the Pacific. Of course, they don't know definitively what's around the corner. There are always what Nassim Nicholas Taleb called black swans, events so left field that they catch everyone off guard. But even COVID, though a brutal shock, wasn't a total surprise. Dominic Cummings was one of those who said a pandemic was a question of when, not if. So I say we don't predict where our culture's going, not because we can't, but because we don't want to. We're nervous about what we'll find, where our imagination will take us. We won't get any help from those who want this stuff to happen, those people who've turned schools and universities and police forces and increasingly workplaces into instruments of indoctrination. They have no interest in sharing their plans for the medium and long term with you. They know that knowledge is power, and they have no intention of sharing either. You think I exaggerate? Look at the way organisations like Black Lives Matter or Stonewall have set themselves up as the new arbiters of moral purity, handing down commandments to the unwashed and sometimes charging us for the privilege. 10 years ago, this was unthinkable, almost. You could see it starting in America on campuses, but the speed with which it spread across the Atlantic is breathtaking. So let's try it then. You try it. If 10 years ago we couldn't imagine a time when British police would be investigating non-crime hate incidents every day, where might we be by 2031? If we couldn't conceive in 2011 that by 2021 we'd be barring students from university unless they passed a test on white fragility, where on earth will we be a decade from now? Woke casting simply requires that you take existing cancel culture trends and see where that curve takes you. So, for instance, veganism might mean school canteens phasing out meat, or laws to limit horse riding, which vegans see as cruel. No institution will be off limits. Sadly, the Queen is unlikely to be with us in 2031, but BLM will be, and I predict the hashtag #RoyalsTooWhite will be a call to arms for Republicans. Radical environmentalists will renounce procreation in ever greater numbers, and urban values will increasingly trump rural values. Game shooting, for example, is probably already on borrowed time. Your passport and driving licence will no longer offer a choice to be either male or female. Companies will increasingly make it very difficult for people who don't agree with a set of corporate values in order to be employed. I have no idea whether any or all of these things will come to pass. I certainly hope they don't. But if you're one of those people who sees Britain as an increasingly bizarre laboratory of social science, a country you struggle to recognise in the mirror, then taking the time to consider the future might be worth your while. Don't be that person in 2031 yelling, "The world's gone mad." We've seen enough of cancel culture by 2021 to have had fair warning of what's in store and coming. That's the Brazier angle. Well, one of the most distinctive and influential voices to emerge from the ruins of Ground Zero is that of Mark Steyn. British by birth and education, he plied his trade as a theatre critic at the Daily Telegraph before moving to North America. There, his Happy Warrior columns in the National Review magazine made him essential reading for those who craved an understanding of the post-9/11 world. His views, especially on radical Islam and demographics, made him a panto villain for some on the left. But his prose, his polemical gifts, and in particular his sense of the ridiculous made him essential reading on the right. His books became bestsellers, but they also made him a target for cancel culture. He spent years fighting successfully fighting legal action brought by Canadian activists who accused him of hate speech. Mark Steyn joins me now from Vermont. Mark Steyn, thanks so much for joining us. Really do appreciate your time. Good to have you. Do I paint a fair description of your career there? I'm particularly struck by the fact you, it seems to me, join a long list of people who started out criticising things in the arts. You know, people like Rod Liddell was a music critic, or still is a music critic. Right. James Dellingpole, cinema critic. You were a theatre critic. Is there something in the nature of being an arts critic which has predisposed you to looking at the world in a certain way?
Well, I think plays and novels and movies and songs are where a nation tells its stories, and the stories it tells are very important, and they're more important than politics, at least in terms of who happens to be Lord Privy Seal this week. No disrespect to whoever is Lord Privy Seal this week. Don't bother writing in to correct me on that. But the point is the stories a nation tells itself tells you who that culture is. So I do think there is a reason why influential commentators, whether you're talking about Rod Liddell or Christopher Hitchens, are familiar with the stories we tell ourselves. That's absolutely the heart of what a society is. And
when you were writing, I was one of those people who bought the National Review just to read your column. It felt like essential reading at the time. I just wonder to what extent you felt in dealing with that incredibly serious stuff in the wake of 9/11 that you had to deploy humour to get away, in a sense, with some very, very tendentious, in the minds of some people, statements. Was it a deliberate policy on your part to try and coat some very uncomfortable truths with a smile and a giggle and some gallows humour, or was that just the way you wrote?
No, I think you should make jokes. If something matters, you should make jokes about it. That's one of the awful things about wokeness and cancel culture is one way to include people in society is actually to make jokes about them. So I don't like the way people quarantine comedy, and a comedian is somebody who stands on stage and makes jokes about, barcode scanners in supermarkets or whatever. You should be able to make jokes about war and pestilence and famine and all the rest of it. Western civilization is basically sliding off a cliff, and whoever succeeds us, whether it's the Chinese or it's the mullahs or it's space aliens from planet Zongo, they're going to split their sides laughing at what we did to ourselves. So we won't have the last laugh, so we might as well at least get in the first laugh.
I think, Mark, you're quite unusual from your particular side of the debate in the context of what I just said there in my monologue, that it seems that people on the more conservative side of the aisle are not very good at reading the road ahead. I don't know if there's something in the nature of that mindset which makes them reluctant to project forward and actually make some serious guesses about what's coming down the track. I made the point in my monologue there that it was actually at a lunch with a friend of mine who said, look, you just can't see what's 5 years away, and maybe we need to try harder.
No, I think that's something to do with the conservative temperament, that well, you used a phrase, you said common law and common sense, and I'm very much into common law. Canada is a common law country, and the United States at least pretends to be one. But common sense presumes that people have something in common. And increasingly in our societies, there's a huge gulf between people who can very often be living in the same street. You know, the nice shishi gay couple living next door to the big bearded mullah and his, however many wives it is, might make chit-chat over the garden fence, but in a sense, what they have in common is actually very limited. So common sense presumes you have a sufficiently socially coherent society to have things in common. And it's perfectly obvious, you know, when you look at the way, if you have people, a society that does not have things in common, one consequence of that is that you need a big government to mediate relations between all these jostling, competing identity groups, so that you wind up to take a subject that you've been talking about on this station, you wind up with an appalling murder of a member of parliament that on the Friday afternoon, that by the Monday morning, everyone has agreed it should be talked about in terms of everything except the central reality of that story. So eventually, when you don't have a society that doesn't have enough in common to have common sense, everything in that society becomes fraudulent and covered up.
Mark, do you think that would be, if heaven forfend, if that had happened to a congressman or a senator in the States, would there have been a similar attempt, as you put it, at avoidance, at avoiding the elephant in the room, or would it have been different in the States?
Well, I like to think it would have been different, but it's true that we've seen, I mean, in some respects, for example, France is one of the, in part because they have a they're a country with many problems, but they have in some ways, a more honest political debate. But in the United States, certainly, people always retreat to their tropes. So that, for example, when there's a mass shooting in America, if anything goes wrong, something that's slightly violent, if it's a white guy, and they know that in the first few minutes, the media are basically saying this is because of hateful, extremist, white male rhetoric. If they're not telling you who actually pulled off the thing, that means it's not a white guy, and they're all going very sotto voce about it, and it's just an event with no wider implications. For example, the Afghan guy whose dad was standing behind Hillary Clinton at some rally, who gunned everyone down in a gay nightclub. And that managed to get presented in the US media as another example of right-wing homophobia, as opposed to the actual reasons why that guy was driven to go along to the gay nightclub.
You mentioned France, Mark. When I think back to the couple of books of yours that I have read and your projections on demographics, I mean, it could almost be, when you listen to Eric Zemmour talking, maybe you read your books, I don't know, but I mean, we're 20 years on now from when you wrote that stuff, but he seems to be singing from your hymn book.
Well, he's trying to move the conversation. You know, he's quite upfront about it. I saw The Spectator, I think it was today, they're complaining that he's very anti-Anglophone. He's anti-British and he's anti-American. Well, so what? That goes for all French politicians. I think it was a former foreign minister of Monsieur Chirac who said 20 years ago that the Anglo-Saxons dedicated to the what he called the cretinization of our civilization. And, you know, if you look at X-Men 37, Cardboard Man 42, Franchise Girl 53, or whatever the next blockbuster is, it's hard actually to disagree with that. So that doesn't matter. What matters is that he's not just being rude about the British, he's also being rude about a lot of other trends in French life, because he thinks a resurgence of Gaullism is necessary to save the Republic. And in that sense, he's talking more honestly than even many, than many members of Parliament would at Westminster. If you look at the map of France after the last election, I think it was the European elections 2 years ago, whatever it was, essentially Macron voters are concentrated in a dozen big French cities, and geographically the bulk of France in that election voted for Le Pen. They're telling the European political establishment, we're dissatisfied with the choices you present to us and we want something more. That's what Republican voters said about Donald Trump in 2015. And the more they keep saying we'd like a wider and wider choice, the more the European political establishment, the American political establishment says, no. We're going to shrink the choices. We're going to leave politics within ever more narrow constraints. And if you want something beyond that, tough, you're not getting it.
Mark, you mentioned the common law. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking to Peter Boghossian, the professor who said, look, I've had enough of cancel culture on this campus, I'm quitting. But part of his story was that he faced a lot of hostility that actually, apart from anything else, just sucked him dry emotionally, legalistically, even financially. And I mentioned in my introduction before you came and joined us this evening that you face something similar in terms of lawfare. For viewers not familiar with the story, pray see it, if you could, in summary form, and how much of a toll it exacted on you, and whether it almost knocked you out of the game.
Well, I wrote a book that was a #1 bestseller in Canada. I mention that particularly because various persons went to the Canadian Islamic Congress, took the case to various Canadian human rights commissions. You now have similar bodies in almost every Western nation. And these are things that where you do not enjoy the protections of common law. You do not enjoy equality before the law. The plaintiff gets all his costs picked up by the taxpayer. Truth is not a defense. The balance, the genius of balance in English common law is not present in these pseudo-legalistic human rights tribunals. Although I was in a courthouse in British Columbia with the exact same royal coat of arms that you would find in a proper courthouse, they were just applying, though, this perversion of law. And what we're seeing here, really, I think, is the criminalization of dissent. So you don't just have a public policy difference, you've actually committed a crime. Now, you mentioned the police a few minutes ago. If you look at the police going round to somebody's house because they've made a joke about Nelson Mandela's funeral, the sort of things the British police, I mean, the United Kingdom, my cheap joke on Britain is that it's a land where everything is policed except crime. And these lazy coppers have decided that they would rather spend their time going round and chastising some fellow for making a transphobic tweet. I think some porn star who'd advertised for a partner for his porn film and was a little shocked to get a transgender lady who had a little bit more than he was in the mood for. The police looked into that case. So we now have a thing where essentially political differences are being de facto criminalized, or at least investigated as potential crimes. That's completely ridiculous. It doesn't speak well for us, and it arises from this perversion of a healthy common law society where everyone's equal before the law, to this new version of events where what matters is what particular identity groups you belong to. There was a case I put in a book of mine a few years ago where a big shot imam said something that was regarded as anti-gay on the BBC, and a gay humanist newspaper picked up on the story and reported the imam's remarks. For the self-same set of words, the imam got investigated for homophobia by Scotland Yard, and the gay humanist newspaper got investigated for Islamophobia by Scotland Yard. So you have this ridiculous situation where the same words are guilty of a completely different crime according to who quotes them. We are destroying our inheritance, the legal inheritance of Britain and the Commonwealth countries is one of its great glories. And in the metropolitan power, at the heart of the imperial metropolis, these values are being trashed by things like this new online speech proposal from the Tories, for example.
And Mark, you'll get the chance to talk about this later this week. We know you're going to be standing in for Nigel Farage. We look forward to it very much indeed. Thanks so much for your time tonight. Thanks a lot. After the break, why the most famous name in Savile Row is facing oblivion, and the children's books that now have to have some trigger warnings attached. What do Little House on the Prairie, The Water Babies and Dr Seuss all have in common? Regular viewers can hazard a guess. They've all fallen foul of cancel culture. From now on, classic children's stories, which form part of Cambridge University's archive, will be given trigger warnings so that unwitting readers don't find themselves scandalised by the contents of such nasty little books or something like that. Andrew Doyle's here to pass my words successfully, I hope.
Yes.
This is the back catalogue of Cambridge University. They own the copyright. They print the books.
It's a particular project which is going on at Homerton College, and they are uploading in digital form a number of their classic texts. And in doing so, this has been part funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Board to the tune of £80,000. And they are doing this. They're applying trigger warnings to the text that they perceive could cause offence among readers. And it's really interesting what they've said. I've got a quotation here. They say they aim to make the digital collection less harmful in the context of a canonical literary heritage that is shaped by and continues a history of oppression. And this is the key thing. They say it would be a dereliction of our duty as gatekeepers to allow such casual racism to go unchecked. Note that they use the word gatekeepers, whereas, of course, their job is custodians. It's not the same thing at all. And they really do see themselves as this very paternalistic role. They're going to protect the public. The truth is, readers can judge for themselves these texts. These
Clearly
texts
they can't, Andrew.
Well, I mean, what a depressing mindset to have, and what an awful worldview. They've also clearly bought into this postmodern idea of the idea that art and literature, that all it is a manifestation of power. All it is the dominant oppressive class exercising their power against the oppressed. And that is such a simplistic view of art, to the extent that I would question whether they understand its purpose at all, and whether they should be in those roles if they don't. It's a very bizarre situation. But, you know, and you take some of these texts like The Water Babies, late 19th century, really fascinating, interesting, frankly bizarre book, which is partly a satire on those scientists of the time who were sceptical about the Darwinian theory of natural selection. This is quite complex and interesting. Yeah. If anyone should be offended by the book, it should be me, because actually the minority group that gets the most brunt in that book is the Irish. But I can read that and I can say, yeah, but Charles Kingsley was writing in 1863, this text is, and I understand that times have changed and attitudes have changed, and what I don't need is some librarian to step in and say, you know, you better take a moment, because you might get upset by this text. I understand the idea of historical context. I understand the idea that art is not necessarily a literal representation of the author's feelings. It's a little bit more complex than that. And I just find it insulting, and I think it's particularly insulting to minority groups, actually, because what it is these people patronising them and saying, we've got to look out for your interests.
We're saying, I mean, I know this read across with Indigenous Americans is difficult. We're not in America, right? But I mean, Little House on the Prairie seems pretty inoffensive, innocuous stuff. But actually, if you are, a native Indian, do you care? I mean, you really care?
Well, I mean, it's possible you do. I mean, we all get offended by different things. The truth is that any book really has the potential to cause offence because of the myriad associations and connotations that can occur in any literary text. But we don't slap a trigger warning on absolutely everything on the chance that it might offend. And it's just not the job of these people in these libraries to be doing this. They are meant to be preserving the books and enabling access to them, not making a judgment about what we should and shouldn't be reading.
Very odd story. Just got time for Oxfam is saying it will stop stocking a bingo game which features 48 inspirational women because transgender and non-binary staff complained that it didn't respect people of all genders. The women included the likes of Jane Austen, Emmeline Pankhurst, Marie Curie, but also, wait for it, here's the sting, J.K. Rowling, whose assertion of the rights of biological women has irritated increasingly vocal trans lobby. I've not played Wonder Women, a bingo game.
Haven't you? You surprised me.
Worth a go? Well, not that we can. You can't get hold of it
You
anymore.
can't anymore, exactly. No, I haven't played it either, but I get the gist. Of course it's J.K. Rowling. It's always J.K. Rowling, isn't it? She's the figure. She's become this sort of demonised, toxic figure from people who haven't engaged with or really understood what she's said. And the key thing here, again, is Oxfam have capitulated. The problem isn't the one or two people who will have complained and said, we're offended by this item that you're selling. It's the fact that Oxfam immediately said, oh, well, we better take it off sale then, because they're scared and intimidated by these kind of complaints. The response that you should have is, well, that's your issue, that you're offended by that item. The answer is, don't buy it, and everyone else can make their own choice.
Would you wear a suit if you didn't have to?
Yes.
OK, well, stand by for this one, because it's the Savile Row Institution which has cut cloth for Winston Churchill, Admiral Nelson, King George III, many others as well. But now Geeves and Hawkes, a tailor with a pedigree which predates the American Revolution, could now be about to fold, the victim of this is lovely music. Should we just play a bit longer? The Chinese parent company with a $4 billion debt crisis, $4 billion debt crisis, the Shandong Ruyi Technology Group had hoped to build a massive fashion empire, but it looks like it's falling apart despite its royal endorsements. The iconic store may be another victim of changing taste, low demand for suits, and perhaps a parent company that doesn't care all that very much. What does it mean for the British suit? Let's speak to the writer and historian of fashion, Tony Glenville. Tony, thank you so much for your patience and joining us this evening. Gyves and Hawkes, I went there about 20 years ago and it was lovely and stuffy and starchy, and I went there again about 8 years ago and it felt like any other gentleman's outfitters.
I think the whole point about Savile Row is it's had to change, and some of it may please some customers and some of it may not please all customers. The problem with the whole Savile Row concept is that just as Paris is women's couture, London is men's tailoring at Savile Row. And to allow this to happen is absolutely appalling. The lack of interest for our heritage and the kind of brands and companies and the amazing skills that Savile Row encompasses, it's just appalling that this should be allowed to happen. It's not the fault of the parent company, who may not really understand that whole heritage thing of Savile Row, may not have all the right people in, but it's bigger than Gyves and Hawkes. It's our whole attitude towards many of the things that people come from all over the world for. Somewhere like Savile Row isn't just you English gentlemen. It's people coming in from all over the world for something we uniquely offer.
But at the end of the day, Tony, I'm with you. I'm absolutely with you. I mean, they make beautiful suits, all the rest of it. And I admire lovely tailoring. It's a skill that should be maintained if it possibly can be. But at the end of the day, you can't make people buy suits.
I don't think you have to worry about whether the suit will survive or not. It's survived in some form or another all this time. And the idea that you're just looking at one group of people who may or may not be wearing suits any longer, especially with a brand like Gyves and Hawkes or any of the other Savile Row tailors, is that, I repeat, it's clients from all over the world. To keep something so niche going, you cannot just rely on an ever-aging local clientele. You have to look globally. And especially in many other countries where a slightly more dandy approach to dressing up still continues in a way that, in Italy and France and Spain, the idea of the suit is very different to the way it's seen in England, particularly amongst a lot of young people. I think that there is still a huge market for a good, great suit.
But at the end of the day, as you know, Tony, you can go to a nice function and you'll see men especially, not so much the women, I would contend, but men especially, who've lost the art of dressing formally or well. It's flip-flops and shorts all the way.
I think it is, but I think one of the great things about style is that it's always cyclical. The lower it goes down towards sportswear, the more there will be younger people who've never worn a suit and younger people who have sort of rejected that whole look, who will suddenly discover it. Because, the mini skirt, for example, every time we kill it off, a while later it comes back. Every time we say the blazer for menswear is dead, another version comes round. And what's interesting is that, it would be lovely to say, well, the suit is dead. Men are not going to wear shirts and ties. Cufflinks will never, ever be worn again. You'd be really sticking your neck out and be sure that within a couple of years...
Tony, we've got to leave it there. We're out of time. Tony Glenville, appreciate your thoughts. Thanks very much indeed. Mark Dolan's next.
Hi there. There'll be some rain during the next 24 hours, especially in the north. Strong southwesterly winds for all, and those winds will be very mild indeed. At the moment, a westerly breeze is pushing showers in from the west, but those showers easing overnight. This next weather front bringing a thickening of cloud by dawn and some outbreaks of rain, especially to northern parts of the UK. But it's really through the evening that the showers disappear across many central and eastern parts of the UK. Clear skies then for eastern England, northeast Scotland as well. Thicker cloud arrives into the west by dawn and some outbreaks of rain into Northern Ireland and western Scotland. Temperatures then rising through the night in the northwest, but they'll fall and it'll be a fairly chilly start for eastern parts of England. A bright start though. and a few mist patches first thing, soon lifting into the afternoon, and spells of rain across northern parts of the UK before it turns drier and brighter. Some cloud breaks developing